Lord be with you, and a warm welcome to you from all of us here in Powerscourt with Kilbride. It's Palm Sunday, and you're welcome to spend the next 15 or 20 minutes with us here in this small square as we remember the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem and have a little look at the two different aspects of what was actually happening on that day that speak into our world today and indeed into our lives. And so as we begin our service today, we pause for just a moment in prayer. When they had come near Jerusalem and had reached Bethphage at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, just say this: 'The Lord needs them,' and he will send them immediately." This took place to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet, saying, "Tell the daughter of Zion, look, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey." The disciples went and did as Jesus had directed. They brought the donkey and the colt and put their cloaks on them, and he sat on them. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowds that went ahead of him and that followed were shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest heaven!" When he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was in turmoil, asking, "Who is this?" The crowds were saying, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee." This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. Just recently I had the pleasure of going to see the movie Oppenheimer the other night with my sister, and I know that I'm in a very small percentile now of people who haven't seen this, and to be honest I was slightly disappointed I hadn't seen it before the Oscars, so that I could be glued to the screen seeing it receiving all of the credit that it clearly deserved. It was rather a magnificent piece of cinematic genius about a genius in his own right, and it was beautifully directed and acted as well. And I remember when the lights came back on and the screen went blank, that feeling of emerging from a different world. And I noticed within myself that there was no small amount of fear, and it wasn't the type of fear that arises in you with a short, sharp shock or anything. It had been rising up slowly within me for the past hour and a half of the movie. I noted with some degree of concern how joyously the team of scientists celebrated the explosion of the first test bomb, how it actually transferred perfectly over to their equal celebration at the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And there, standing in the middle of all of them, was the man who had created this, with a look on his face that said, "God, what have I done?" It reminded me of our world today and how our inclination to adhere to one-upmanship. As long as we're putting the enemy down or the other person down, that's okay. We'll celebrate that fact. And very little has changed. But I wanted to talk today about the fact that 2,000 years earlier, in the vast city of Jerusalem, encased in its beautiful walls, with its eight different gates of access through these walls into the city, Jesus arrived on a colt, and in a distinctly different way than somebody else was arriving. The somebody else, the experts will tell you, was Pontius Pilate, who spent an awful lot of the year in Caesarea by the sea. But for festivals, such as the one that was about to take place in Jerusalem, he would make an appearance, and he would do this with the deliberate intent of powermongery, I suppose. He would arrive in a distinctly different way through another gate, we'll say for today's purposes, than Jesus did. If we picture the aerial map of Jerusalem in our mind and think of Jesus entering one gate on one side and Pilate on the other, it will serve us very well for today's purposes. Pilate would have arrived in a trump of glory. He would have been seated on his finest steed, bedecked in full armour. He would have had around him, in front of him and behind him, foot soldiers. There would have been a glint of sunshine on steel. And he was sending out a really deliberate message to the festival, the people who were gathered: don't mess with this. He was entering, if you like, through the gate of fear and control. Because I am set to remind you yet again, in this small square, that the two base human emotions in this world, all emotions actually emanate from them, are love and fear. And from this particular gate, in his shining armour, Pontius Pilate is operating from a place of fear. Fear, I'm sure, within himself, and the fear that he is instilling in the people who see him, because this was Roman control. This Roman control wanted to still the voices of any unrest among, well, particularly, I suppose, the Jewish people at that time, because there was this young prophet who was walking around talking a different theology, and it was possibly even palpable to feel the unrest in the place. So Pontius Pilate really wanted to hammer this home, that you are under our control and you don't step out of line. If we operate from a place of fear, we tend to cling to the next best thing to ourselves, something that will keep us afloat, something tangible, something that will possibly give us momentary delight or comfort. It's worldly things, or it's addictions. It's those little glimmers and sparkles of joy that we can get, and there's nothing wrong with them, but it only passes. It passes in an instant. And what we're really trying to do, if we're coming from a place of fear, is take back control again. And yet, while you are grasping for control or following the crowd in this worldly way of being, you're blocking yourself from God. God is still very much there, but your attention is elsewhere. Remember the young rich man who came to see Jesus and said, I've done everything right. I've towed the line completely. Now tell me, what can I do to follow you? And Jesus said, come ahead, but first go and sell everything that you possess. And that was just one step too far for that worldly rooted, if you like, individual. So how do we operate from a place of love? It seems like a really hard task. Well, it is a hard task. It relies on us trusting a higher power, for starters. It relies on us asking for grace. When Jesus entered by a different gate, he entered with trust and was given grace to face into his biggest fear. He showed us that the underlying driving force behind what he was about to do was actually love, not fear. Operating from a place of love is exactly what Jesus came to teach us during his lifetime, his teachings and preachings on this planet. Operating from a place of love is not as easy as it seems, but it builds upon itself within an individual's life. It requires us to not necessarily get caught up in the crowd, but to make decisions for ourselves that are based on love. All of a sudden, the consequences throughout our lives change when we work from a place of love. We enter by a smaller, simpler gate, but it's a harder road to travel sometimes, because it's oh so easy to jump on the bandwagon. But when we are to think for ourselves, from a place of love, in the presence of the Christ, that narrow gate becomes a little more accessible for us. Jesus says that it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. If we can shed the things that keep us bound to this earth, some of them are very good, but if we can shed the things that prevent us from operating from a place of love, then we have taken a step through the same gate as the Christ himself, that narrow gate that leads to life eternal.